In this video, we're going to be talking about three different tools: the pipe tool, some various sweep tools, and the revolve tool. Let's start with the pipe tool. I'm going to zoom in on these two-dimensional lines that I have here, and oftentimes you're just going to want to turn those into some 3D geometry, and the most basic tool to do that with is the pipe tool. This is really a basic version of what we're going to get into next, which is the sweep tool. And the pipe tool is found under the Derive 2 palette, and it is a new tool in FormZ version 10. So if I simply click on a path that I want to turn into a pipe, that's all it takes is just clicking on it. Now, of course, you can also pre-select all of your pipes ahead of time if you want to apply it to multiple objects very quickly. Then click on the pipe curve tool and then click to execute that command across all of those all at once. Now, this is parametric if you're still in the object buffer when we've just created those pipes. So if I were to change the diameter, for example, to something larger like 2 feet, I can still do that and it applies that all at once. But as soon as I switch to another tool, those are no longer parametric. You'll notice there's no controls available. Now we can pipe any line that we want. It doesn't have to be a straight segment like these. So for example, I could draw a spline over here and I can then pipe that as well. These shapes also do not have to be two-dimensional on a reference plane. So if I undo that and I right click and show controls, and I'm going to grab this control point and I'm going to start to drag it, and I have my perpendicular option turned on by using the command key on the Mac or the control key on Windows. You can see now I have reoriented this curve in 3D. So if I zoom around and look at it, you can see it kind of goes up towards the middle and back down. And once again, using the pipe curve on that, it just takes that pipe and pushes it along that curve. So 2D or 3D, one curve or multiple curves. It is a very simple and welcome addition to FormZ version 10. Next up is the sweep tool, and the sweep tool takes a source shape and it pushes it along a path shape. So one of the neat things about using this tool in FormZ is you can have your source shapes oriented however you drew them. They could be flat on the reference plane, they could be vertical, and my path shape can also be in any orientation, and FormZ will automatically figure out the correct orientation if you have the right option chosen. So I'm going to click on my Axial Sweep tool and I'm going to take a look at my tool options. Again, we have different model types. This time we have different alignment options, we have scale and rotation options, we have caps, and a few other things as well. What I'm going to do is choose the Centroid option, which gives us the results I was just talking about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on my source shape, which it says to do in the action palette, and then it says to click on the path shape. And you can see that it reorients that circle from flat on the reference plane to vertically to push it correctly along the path, which is exactly what I was expecting. Now, the difference between this and the pipe tool, using a circle as my source shape, is that we have controls after the fact. So parametric controls can be engaged while in the object buffer here. So we can also see that by clicking on some of these controls, we get some very different options than we did with the pipe command. For example, I can now peel this circle open so that it is an open shape as it travels along this path, because the circle itself is also a parametric option drawn using the basic circle tool. Now this is great because it gives us tons of other options to explore different geometry types as we're using the sweep tool. One of the other things that we can do once we're pushing a new shape along a path using the sweep tool is we can change the scale as it travels along the path. So for example, right now we're going from a scale of 1 down to a scale of 0.25 from beginning to end. Now, if I wanted to flip that around and go from 0.25 to 1, there is another option here where I can just simply reverse the path by clicking on that. And you can see now that it starts with the full scale circle on the other end of the path and brings it down to 0.25 as it gets to this end. And again, all of this is parametric. Even the path shape itself, you can manipulate the shape of that after the fact and get something completely different. Now you can also select multiple shapes to push along a path at the same time by using the pre-pick method. So I'm going to use my pick tool, select 2 objects before invoking the Axial Sweep tool, and now I'm going to click on my path to push those along there. Still using the same options that I had programmed in there from the last time where it's doing that scale, but you can see it's taken both objects and moved them to the path, applied to their centroid, so you can see the alignment that's going on there. And again, these shapes are parametric. So if I were to click on my rectangle, I can manipulate that shape as it goes along the path by changing its geometry at the source. And I can also change the orientation of this as it rotates along my path. So we can get a lot of really interesting geometry playing around with these options while we can see this parametric display buffer. Now, if I deselect these objects and I reselect them by using the pick tool and I right click and show controls, we can see all of those controls show back up. Now we can also take shapes and push them along closed paths. So I have a very simple two-dimensional surface rectangle here. Again, I'm going to use the Axial Sweep method. I'm going to choose my source shape, which is going to be this rectangle, and push it along this closed surface. So clicking on my surface, we can see that it takes my rectangle and it pushes it along there. And again, I can change that orientation. So maybe I was expecting something more like that, for example, or maybe I want a different angle altogether. Now, where things get interesting with this is, of course, I can still change the shape of my path as well, but I can also go back into scale and rotation. And we can see now with a smooth model type chosen, we're getting some very interesting geometry as we push that object along that path. So this time, instead of scaling it from beginning to end like we did on the open path, it's scaling it from beginning all the way back to beginning. So the shape scale has to match up at the beginning and the end of my shape, but in the middle, it is going down to that lower scale point of 0.25. This is really great because, again, we can still completely flex this geometry during this object buffer phase to get something completely different. And again, this stays editable. So if I right click, show controls, I still get those parameters so that I can modify the shape after the fact. So this isn't maybe a typical application of the sweep tool, but we can see how we can get some really interesting shapes using it. Now we can also push open shapes along open or closed paths. So I'm going to again use the Axial Sweep tool, click on my source shape, which is this two-dimensional line, and then click on my path, again using the centroid option, and it's going to take that shape and push it along, and we can see we're still rotating and scaling. Maybe let's turn rotation off so that we just get a very basic shape as it pushes it along, and it's just scaling it. Again, we can rotate that after the fact to get maybe something a little bit more interesting. And of course, we can change the source shape to be something completely different if we wanted to. And because this is a three-dimensional spline, I can grab these points and I can drag those. So again, tapping the Command key on Mac and Control on Windows, I can drag these points vertically perpendicular from the reference plane to get completely different shapes. And it's really great to play around with these once you're in the object buffer mode for the sweep tool, because you can get some very interesting geometries using it. Now let's take a look at a different example. What I want to do here is create a ramp. So again, using the centroid option, I'm going to take my source shape, which is going to be the profile of my ramp, and I'm going to push that along my arc that I want that ramp to travel along. And if I go to a front view, we can see that it's just a flat ramp. So what I'm going to do is grab my endpoint and I'm going to drag that vertically. So let's say about 12 feet high. And you'll notice when I do that, because of the nature of arcs, you can see it's maintaining the orientation between the beginning and end point. So what I'm going to do this time is grab my initial rotation angle and I'm going to drag that down so that it looks about flat. And I'm just eyeballing this for this exercise. But you can see when I do that, it severely impacts the end of the ramp. If you were to walk up this ramp, by the time you got to the top, you'd probably be falling off, or at least seriously using this inner handrail to keep you from falling off. So this is an example of where I would want to use this rotate command. So I'm going to turn this on, and you can see by going with something around 25 degrees, it actually flattens out the end as it gets to the top. So that's a great use case for the rotate option as your source travels along the path to get the kind of orientation change that you need from beginning to end of a sweep. Again, all of these controls are parametric. If I click on my ramp after the fact and show controls, I can modify the arc itself to change the radius of it, and I can also modify the source shape and the rotation of the beginning and the end. I could even change the scale of it if I wanted to. So for example, if I wanted this ramp to get wider as it went from beginning to end, I can open my inspector, I can go into my parameters here, and I can change the scale right here, and I can go with something more like 2 when it gets to the top. And we can see that it actually enlarges the ramp as it goes from the top. So by using the inspector, we have access to all of our parameters after the fact. Now let's take a look at one more option here, which is a different alignment option. In this case, I have 3 different source shapes and a spline that is 3-dimensional. So looking at my front view here, we can see that this spline also goes up as it goes from beginning to end, and I have 3 source shapes. So using my pre-pick method, I'm going to select all 3 source shapes. I'm going to click on my axial sweep, and this time, instead of using Centroid, I'm going to use the as positioned. And before I click on that, I'm going to go to the top view and show that my source shapes are oriented perpendicular to my path. And I took my time to place that exactly where I wanted before I'm sweeping it along that path. So to get the results that I'm desiring from this, it was important to do that ahead of time. So using the as positioned alignment option, I'm going to maintain the position of all 3 of these independent pieces as they're pushed along this path. I'm going to turn off rotation, and then I'm going to click on my path, and you can see that it has maintained all 3 of those shapes in their original position as it pushed those along the path. Of course, all of these are editable after the fact, as they were with all of the other examples, but using a different alignment option gave me the results that I wanted to get out of it. So for example, if I undo that and choose axial sweep with Centroid chosen, and then I click on my path, you can see it pulls both of my handrails down to the path itself, and it completely changes the orientation of these. So that's not the result I was after. I definitely want to use as positioned and then click on my path to get the ramp exactly how I wanted it. Now there's one more thing in the sweep tool that I want to cover, and that is the 2-source sweep. And I'm just going to do a very basic example of this. Clicking on the 2-source sweep button, you'll notice in the action palette it says select the first source shape, and then it says to select the second source shape, and then it says to select the path. So 3 different objects are necessary, and what it does is it takes that first source shape and it blends into the second source shape as it travels along the path. And of course, those 2 source shapes can be anything you want, and they are editable after the fact. So for example, if I expected that actually to be oriented flat as it got to the end, I would maybe want to rotate that after the fact. And of course, you can reverse this. So you could reverse the path to perhaps get something that you were inspecting instead of what it gave you by default. Let's take a look at a third sweep tool, and that is the 2-path sweep. It's the third icon in the second row of the Derive 2 palette. And what this does is it takes our source shape, and instead of pushing it along a single path, it will push it along 2 paths at the same time. In this example, I have 2 different splines that are roughly the same length. They don't have to be, but just for illustrative purposes on this one, to keep it relatively simple, I drew those. And these are both laying flat on the reference plane along with all of my source objects. The first one I'm going to start with is this rectangle, and you'll notice right away when I hover over one of these source shapes, if I hover close to an edge, it'll select that edge. Where an object has sub-elements like edges and faces, you want to make sure you're clicking on the right one. So I'm going to click in the middle of the face to select the entire object, and then following the action palette, I'm going to select my first path and then my second path. You'll see that it reorients my rectangle into a vertical position and pushes it along both paths at the same time. So as my paths get farther apart in the middle, it's also scaling my rectangle vertically to maintain the proportion of that rectangle as it travels along both paths. As we get toward the back of the paths, you'll see it brings it back down to its original size. Now there is another option in our tool options that we haven't had previously, which is to preserve the height of the source shape. So instead of proportionally scaling whatever our original source is as it travels along the paths vertically, we can choose to turn that on so that it keeps the same height throughout. So when you're doing a 2-path sweep, this is another consideration that you're going to want to make while you're using it. And of course, we can adjust the parametrics of the paths themselves after the fact. So I can grab one of those handles and I can manipulate it vertically. And if I tap the command key, I could manipulate it along the reference plane. So a really flexible tool to get some very interesting geometries. Let's undo all that and let's go to our second shape that I want to show you, which is this arc. So again, just a parametric two-dimensional arc. I'm going to choose that as my source shape. Then I'm going to click on my two different paths to sweep it along. This time the preserve height option was on. And so once again, as this arc travels along, it's scaling it in width and not in height. So if I turn preserve height off, you can see it bulges to maintain its proportion as it's traveling along those two different paths. Now, once again, because this was a two-dimensional parametric arc, we get the parameters of that original arc. So if we wanted to change different attributes about that, we could change the location of its start point, end point, and its center point, and completely change the geometry outcome of the two-path sweep. For the third example, I'm going to use this open vector line as my source shape, and this time I'm going to click on my two paths in the opposite order. I'm going to click on the right path first and the left path second. You'll notice that it reorients my object in what I would consider to be upside down. So it does matter which order you choose your paths in and how it orients the source shape along those two paths. Of course, you could always just click on your rotation and flip it over 180 degrees after the fact if you wanted to. Just be aware that the order that you click on them does matter. Now, of course, we have all of those same controls that we've had on the other ones. So with a vector line, we can actually control each point of that line independently and change the shape. And we can also mess with preserving the height or not. For the final example, I'm going to use this 2D wall surface of that same capital M shape using the two-path sweep tool. Again, very carefully clicking on the middle of the face so that I don't accidentally grab an edge here. I do want to tell Form Z to sweep the entire shape along my two paths. So clicking there with the entire thing highlighted and then choosing my two paths. This time we have one additional control, and that is the thickness of the M shape. So because it pushed a closed 2D wall shape along these two different paths at the same time, and because that was a parametric wall, I can then click on that and adjust the thickness of it visually after I have already produced it. That can be pretty useful. Now I'm going to deselect this object with the pick tool, and I'm going to right click on it and choose to show controls so that we can show one more option that could be potentially useful for you. And that is that as I'm sweeping along these two paths, right now it is flat along the reference plane. I'm going to use a window selection to grab my two center points, and then I'm going to use the move tool to move those, and I'm going to tap the command key on my keyboard to perpendicularly modify the location of those 2 points. So you can see I could bend them down or I can bend this up. Because these were two splines, it is allowing me to change those parametrically after I've already made them. I could select just one of them and also just move one if I wanted to as well. So a lot of amazing controls and options that we have over these types of geometries using different variations of the sweep tool. Now let's take a look at the Revolve tool. This tool is also found in the Derive 2 palette, and it is the first tool found in there. So the Revolve tool takes a source shape and it spins it around an axis. So what I have here is a spline drawn in the front view. And one thing that you'll notice about this spline is that it ends at exactly the origin of the project file. And that's important because when I use the Revolve tool and I spin it around my axis, I want the bottom of this shape to be closed off. So now I'm going to follow what it says in the action palette. I'm going to select a source shape, and then you'll see that it says to select an axis of the reference plane or a straight segment. We'll get into the straight segment part in a minute. Now I'm going to hover over my Z-axis, and you'll see that it actually highlights in red. If I were hovering over any other axis, I could revolve around either one of those as well. I'm going to choose the Z-axis to get the shape that I want. Again, just like using the sweep tool, this is a fully parametric object. If I go to my front view and I manipulate my shape, I can update that geometry in real time after I've already revolved it. Going back to 3D, we can see that this shape indeed does have a closed off bottom. And we have the option now to look in the Revolve tool options for some different things here. So I could change the revolution angle, something like 180 degrees. I could also change the direction, so I could go clockwise instead of counterclockwise. I can also choose for it to be continuous or stepped, meaning stepped, it actually turns that into facets, and we can change the number of steps so that it actually raises or lowers that resolution as it goes around the axis of revolution. It's a really amazing tool to play around with the tool options on and get some different results that you maybe weren't expecting up front. One other control that shows up beyond the original editing controls for the spline itself is this yellow axis here, and if I click and drag on that, you'll see that it changes the revolution angle dynamically. So you can either type that number in here, or you can grab that control on the screen and manipulate it there as well. Now let's take a look at drawing our own axis, and I happen to have one here on another layer, which is just another two-dimensional line. It's important to note right here that both of these objects are coplanar, meaning if I go into the top view, they are both on the same plane. And that alignment is important when you're doing revolves. So again, I'm going to choose the revolve tool. I'm going to click on my source shape, and then I'm going to click on my new axis of revolution instead of the z-axis. And now you'll notice because of the positioning of this, when I click on here and I go down to the bottom, there's actually a hole in the bottom. Let's go ahead and move this back to continuous, and let's go back to 360-degree revolution angle. And you can see now the bottom of my vase, because it was moved away from the center of my axis, I have a hole in the bottom. So that's something to be aware of. When you don't have the source shape touching the axis of revolution, you are going to have holes in your geometry that you may or may not need to patch up later. Now, your axis of revolution does not need to be in alignment with the axes on the reference plane. So if I go to the front view, let's go ahead and just draw a new axis of revolution that's at an angle over here. And I'm going to go back to my 3D view so we can watch what happens. I'm going to click on the revolve, I'm going to click on my source, and then I'm going to click on my axis of revolution, and you can see that it spins that object around a new axis. So you get a completely different result by changing the axis. That's something else to be aware of as you're using this tool. Now you can also revolve closed shapes around an axis of revolution. They don't have to be open. And what I'm going to do here is select both of these this time and then click on the revolve tool and click on the axis of revolution. You can see it spins both separate objects around at the same time. They're both now parametric in the same way, so I can choose to go stepped. I can choose to go with something like 3 steps instead. And again, using the revolve tool, you can get some very interesting results as you play with the different parameters. Going back and this time choosing a different axis of revolution, you can see, again, changing the axis gives us substantially different results, something definitely to be aware of as you play around with this tool. And this time I'm going to go back to continuous and maybe choose the revolution angle of 180 degrees and zoom in on this to show you what the other option here is in the tool options, which is caps. You can see by pushing these two closed shapes around this axis of revolution, it's showing these objects as being open-ended. So even though they were closed surfaces, it just took the outlines of those objects and revolved them around. That's where this caps option comes in, and this only works when you don't have a 360-degree revolution angle chosen. So here with the 180, we can see that we're getting these ends exposed, and you may choose that you want to have caps turned on for that so that you have solid objects instead of surfaces. Once again, you can select these objects, you can right-click and show controls on those objects and have access to all of those original points and completely change these shapes after the fact to get very different results. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to get notified when new videos are released on this channel, click the subscribe button below and click the notification bell icon to get a notification when new videos are released. See you in the next one.